Nukitashi is a game that I have thought about almost constantly since I first read through it, mostly focusing on the specific reasons as to why it resonated so much with the story, and more specifically its protagonist, Junosuke Tachibana. This mostly comes down to how it portrays sex and gender-based insecurity, and how that insecurity relates to, and in many ways is created by, an inherently sexualized society. Junosuke, after losing his parents in a car accident, takes himself and his sister Asane and moves into their childhood home in a tropical paradise called Seiran Island. Much to their dismay, the island has been turned to a go-to tourist destination for all things raw dogging, public fucking, and dick sucking. Junosuke, as a proud virgin who is saving his chastity for the future love of his life, becomes an enemy of the state and hunted down for refusing to have perverted sex. In response to this grave injustice, Junosuke and Asane, with the help of their friends Katakiri Nanase, Watarai Hinami, and Hattori Masaki, decide to work together to try and destroy the perverted sex law once and for all, clashing with a state-affiliated organization called the SHO. The SHO acts as a police organization that enforces the perverted sex law in public spaces around the island, punishing those who refuse to participate. The story follows Junosuke and his ragtag gang of misfits in their battle against the SHO, mainly its child organization the FS, fighting against three of its highest-ranking members, Onabuto Ikuko, Reizane Toka, and Tadasugawa Rei, in an effort to destroy the perverted sex law, tackling their insecurities, and falling in love along the way. Junosuke, as an outsider looking in, creates a hateful and discriminatory view of who Ikuko, Toka, and the FS as a whole is in his head, which poisons every single interaction they have after their initial meeting. Junosuke is the outsider. He is the foreigner to Seiran Island, and much of the story is focused on how much he orients his life in the island, not just escaping from the perverted sex law, but actively and hatefully stereotyping anyone who he sees as promiscuous or slutty, with sluts in his mind being anyone who has sex outside a romantic relationship. Even characters that end up becoming his long-term allies like Nanase are not safe from his ire. Junosuke does not initially hate the islanders, but he cannot coexist with them, because Junosuke requires his hatred of them to affirm his minority status through ideology. And Junosuke can justify his hatred for the islanders based on this ideology, to make his fight for justice for himself and his sister seem morally just, regardless of whatever actions he ends up taking in the process. It is said within the game that Seiran Island itself has multiple structural supports in place to support peaceful participation within the social order, with these structures primarily revolving around the FS. The FS is primarily made up of students recruited directly from the school through a scholarship program. Combining this financial incentive with the fact that the school's curriculum itself heavily promotes perverted sex gives the sense that the perverted sex law isn't just the background structure that governs society, but also exists as an idea that forms a social structure that people become emotionally and materially invested in. This creates a shared sense of identity among the Seiran Islanders of hedonistic perversion. However, the emotional investment in Seiran Island's culture that the natives and tourists of the island have is the primary motivator for participation, simply because perverted sex feels good. By framing the perverted sex law as exploitative, the game frames the islanders themselves, in their endless lust for sex, as active participants in the system, and therefore guilty. Junosuke hates the islanders, and the game itself, in framing our experience of everything that happens in the game through the lens of his worldview, wants you to hate them too. Throughout the game, Toka, the leader of the FS and the school student council president, invites Junosuke over to her office on multiple separate occasions to talk to him, and try to understand why he hates sex so much. The primary in-universe purpose for these conversations is for Toka to probe Junosuke's mind, to try and understand him as a person, and ultimately get him to accept perverted sex. She believes that sex exists as a higher and more powerful form of communication than simply exchanging thoughts and desires through language alone. Most of these meetings between them end with any sexual activity taking place. However, Toka is portrayed during these scenes as secretive and manipulative, almost speaking like a cult leader, using sex to brainwash her fanatical and lust-crazed followers, causing Junosuke and the player to be constantly on edge. When will she rape him? Toka views Junosuke as nothing more than just an interesting challenge, viewing his trauma and insecurity as a puzzle to solve, and Junosuke is ultimately afraid of Toka. viewing her as an unpredictable and unshakable threat to his very identity as a person. Most of these scenes highlight how much Junosuke and Toka are entirely unwilling to view each other as anything but archenemies. To them, making the other submit to their respective ideology matters more than letting each other live and let live. Their ideological war comes to a head during their last cordial meeting together before their final battle near the climax. She pins him down, raping him. She literally presents her sexual assault as the final decider in their ideological feud, saying that if he comes, he loses. She starts sucking his dick, and long story short, Junosuke's sadistic desire wins out, and Junosuke starts, to put it bluntly, raping her mouth. The game goes to great pains to make sure you know that Toka is very much in pain, with Junosuke taking clear pleasure from her pain. This scene I think is significant because it highlights that both Toka and Junosuke ultimately are both deliberately ignoring the other's feelings. Not only just to affirm their ideology, but out of a base primal sadistic urge. All talk of ideology and ideals is thrown out of the window for the sake of pure sadistic hatred. However, these sex scenes primarily show us that the way native islanders like Ikuko and Toka view sex are not intentionally evil or even portrayed as disgusting or immoral. They view human relationships only through the lens of their limited worldview, taught to them by the culture of the island, and assign qualities like secretly enjoying sex to Junosuke while ignoring his actual feelings. Ultimately, they are just like Junosuke, blinded by their ideology and past trauma, leading them to view sex and other people in general through a strict set of self-serving assumptions about their thoughts and desires that ultimately exist to justify downplaying and ignoring other people's feelings. The oral scene with Toka shows us that deep down, the desire to control other people, divorced from lofty moral ideals, is just sadism. This lack of empathy on the part of Junosuke is coupled with an image of perverted sex that is shown to be a luxury that the majority enjoys, values, and willingly participates in for its own sake. The law does not afford any specific class of people material benefits based on their identity, and does not rely on the islanders themselves to police and shun non-sex havers. Hate is expected to be directed towards the Seiren Islanders by the players simply for having different social values than them, and through doing this, intentionally or not, putting Junosuke in the exact same moral position as the islanders who refuse to respect his own desire to remain celibate. This gives us the sense that, on the one hand, the perverted sex law creates a social landscape ripe for capitalist exploitation, but also hinting to us that there is something deeply compelling about the freedom the perverted sex law affords people who buy into the system. The anarchic nature of a society that allows ultimate sexual freedom might be highly valuable, just to people other than Junosuke, and to people other than me. The FS exists as a warning of what Junosuke could become. The FS acts as an organization whose purpose is to police and reinforce a social script that flattens human relationships with the hammer of a perverted ideology. If you refuse to take part in that perversion, and as such face a world that punishes you for existing, it is much easier for you to adopt ideology to protect your heart against the reality that, in participation in the rules and customs of society, you are in some sense guilty of the kind of dehumanization that you hate so much. And once you begin to participate in dehumanization as self-defense, it's easy to hurt others in the same way you were hurt, or the same way you hurt others in the past. Junosuke creates ideology in opposition to perverted sex simply by existing as a non-sex haver. He willingly lets this ideology become the core of his being. He is so obsessed with this ideology that his own comrades, as he calls them, become sources for his insecurity. For example, Wata is insecure about her short stature and her small chest, leading to everyone else on the island thinking of her as a child and refusing to have sex with her. However, she doesn't hate the islanders. She doesn't let her insecurity about her small chest govern the way she sees other people. She wants to be seen, to be loved, to be desired sexually just like everyone else. But the perverted sex law doesn't allow her that freedom to be sexual in the way that feels most comfortable to her. At first, Junosuke is shocked by her strength. How can she function without the specter of her insecurity haunting her every waking moment? The empathy that Junosuke had to learn throughout the course of the story, Wata already had. Nanase is Junosuke's biggest reminder of his insecurity and biases against anyone he thinks is slutty, but ultimately becomes his reason for living after overcoming those biases, while Misaki holds a similar kind of insecurity-fueled hatred that Junosuke has. However, Junosuke, in loving her for all that she is, learns to love himself when that love is reciprocated back to him. The three heroines of the game work to force Junosuke out of his narcissism, because, unlike Junosuke, Wata and Misaki do not conceive of themselves as outside the culture of Seiren Island. Wata's insecurity primarily comes from the feeling of rejection she feels by not being able to participate in perverted sex like everyone else, while Misaki's insecurity comes from being unable to live up to unrealistic body standards. At first, instead of viewing themselves as anti-copulators, they view themselves as failed Seiren Islanders. However, Wata's identity does not entirely hinge on her subjective level of success she considers herself to have achieved within the context of the culture of Seiren Island, and Misaki and Junosuke ultimately replace their self-hatred with their love for each other. In the end, the NLNS consider themselves more than just revolutionaries, but each other's friends, and most potently, one of them will eventually consider Junosuke their lover. Nukitashi shows us that investing in ideology itself is a mistake. In flattening yourself into only a vector for you to express your vision of what the world should be, kills any and all possibility of enjoying your life at all, inside or outside the system. The true value of resistance comes not in the ideology underpinning that resistance, but the people you are trying to help, the life you want, not only for yourself, but the people around you. It's saying that sometimes resistance requires empathy, not necessarily with the enemy, but with the people who participate in the system. With the sex seekers themselves being framed as victims of an exploitative capitalist system that wields sex as an ideological weapon to encourage people to buy into a collective fantasy of constant hedonistic pleasure and lust, to create a consumer culture that exploits sex and sexuality for the sake of profit. Junosuke, as a man, cannot accept his own insecurity. He cannot accept that he likes to be sexually dominated by strong, confident women like Ikuko and Toka. He cannot accept that the FS members and all of his friends are fundamentally the same, just young adults exploring their feelings and sexuality, and in some ways that he doesn't approve. He cannot accept that other people hold different values than him. In refusing to empathize with the other, you actively hurt them. Ikuko is so solely obsessed with Junosuke as a sex object, she refuses to see him as anything but a lump of flesh in his pants, and in doing so, rapes him on multiple separate occasions. Junosuke, blinded by his pain, refuses to acknowledge her as anything but a threat to his fragile masculine identity. Sex, as an idea, and as it exists as a social act between two people, is reduced in their minds to being not only just a vector for their own satisfaction, but core to their ideology and identity. Ikuko needs sex to be socially valued, to justify her hedonistic lifestyle, with that lifestyle coming as a direct consequence of being denied any and all outlets to express her femininity as a child. Her lust for Junosuke blinds her to his feelings, raping him on multiple occasions. Up until the second half of the story, Junosuke needs the perverted sex law to continuously justify his self-perception as a revolutionary soldier, fighting for love and freedom. Therefore, Junosuke needs Ikuko to embody everything he hates, a promiscuous woman who only cares about sex. They can't acknowledge each other because they can't exist without the perverted sex law and sex itself continuously creating and validating their identities, ignoring and hurting each other in the process. Sex is so tied up with societal ideas of personhood and individuality that your personal ideas about sex and gender relations take the form of an ideology when they chafe against societal norms. And that ideology can directly affect the way you treat the people around you. Add in the existence of authoritarian policing, and you have a system of punishment that completely and utterly denies you as an individual, and the choices you make regarding your own body. Combine this with Junosuke's traditional but comedic form of masculine insecurity, and he turns himself, willingly, into an ideological zombie. A man who desperately wants to conceptualize himself as an enlightened radical fighting for the freedom of sexual minorities, and only acts within the bounds of his own made-up principles of love, chastity, and purity. Nukitashi exploits eroge readers' tendency to self-insert by actively making Junosuke's actions chafe against the reader's ideal of what the reader wants Junosuke to be. The reader wants Junosuke to affirm his existence through his ideals, with the easiest and most potent vector for expressing those ideals being through hate. I want this because I want as little friction between me and Junosuke as possible. By showing Junosuke waver in his ideals during his confrontations with members of the FS, and him ultimately accepting Ikuko, Toka, and Rei as allies, he no longer fits the masculine ideal the player has grafted onto him. Instead, he affirms his agency as his own person, a unique character in his own right that does not solely exist as a self-insert for the reader, but as a person that has the possibility of being less or different from the player's ideal, my ideal. I want Junosuke to express the same level of body dysmorphia that I feel. I want him to just be an outlet for my own frustrations and insecurities. I want him to affirm my own fantasy of outsider status and social rebellion, but the games ultimately refuse to fulfill that desire by affirming Junosuke's agency as a character. This forces the reader to directly engage with the themes of the game. By writing Junosuke and his ideals to roughly align with what visual novel players typically value, and then betraying the reader's expectations, the game holds up a mirror to the player. There is a sense of narcissism present in wanting an eroge protagonist to be everything you are, to do everything you do. Junosuke has his own fantasy of what he wants sex to be. Junosuke's fantasy, however, is the one that most closely aligns with our social expectations of what sex is as an audience. More specifically, the male sexual fantasy mostly associated with certain genres of eroge. Most of the social conflict in the story comes from the tension between the characters' fantasies of their sexual partner, desired or otherwise, both in and out of sex. The narrative grapples with confronting the uncomfortable reality that your fantasy of who the other person is in a sexual relationship can chafe against reality in ways that don't just manifest themselves in abstract notions of how you vaguely feel about the opposite sex, but in your everyday interactions with other people, man or woman. These fantasies of the other person can exist as both an aggressive, lustful obsession as well as a self-affirming and masturbatory hatred of the other. It can be difficult, even within resistance, to not play by hegemonic society's rules. Your existence as a radical becomes another vessel for the system to increase its authoritarian control. Without friend groups and alternative social structures to support your struggle, you become nothing but your resistance. Your negative experiences of sex, bullying, and trauma affect the way you interact with others years after the initial shock of the trauma has passed. The kinds of trauma that Nukitashi presents to us is always social and structural trauma, not just interpersonal abuse occurring between two unrelated individuals, but trauma that comes as a natural side effect of abusive social and family structures. The trauma in Nukitashi is the kind that leads to a cycle of abuse. For a big chunk of the story, Junosuke is completely reliant on the island to affirm himself in relation to it. To make himself an actor in a big stage play where he is a revolutionary hero. It gives him an opportunity to concretely manifest his identity into the world, to show once and for all that his life means something. He wants a god to come down to affirm to him that his choice was the right one, and he should keep on choosing that choice forevermore. But there is no right choice. Just a long list of nostalgic ephemera whose associated memories slowly become more and more meaningless as time forces you to change, until you're something entirely different than who you thought you were. There is not one moment where it will hit you that in your tireless quest for self-actualization and rebellion you have become your ideal. At the end of the day, it feels like nothing has changed.
That in fact, you did not become a pure unsullied vessel to manifest your ideals into the world. You are not a pure champion for what is good and priceless. You are just you. A pathetic writhing mass of infantile insecurities. Maybe I just want to affirm myself in relation to Jinosuke. Maybe this analysis itself is my own masturbatory fantasy. In my narcissism, I might be just projecting my own insecurities onto Jinosuke and grasping for straws that were never there. Writing a fan fiction for my own narcissistic pleasure masquerading as intellectualism. Maybe I'm the problem. However, Jinosuke ultimately does grow. Fumino acts like kind of a litmus test for him, to see if he is willing to look beyond her immediate usefulness to him as the key to destroying the perverted sex law. In the end, he does, thanks to his growing love and empathy he learns through his romantic relationship with one of the three heroines. The power of love loosens the grip his insecurity and trauma have on his mind, so he refuses to just use and discard her like a tool after she outlives her usefulness. He's willing to bring Fumino into the fold and treat her normally, like a friend. Taking a step back, I think the moral of Nukitashi is to not flatten yourself into a two-dimensional caricature through obsessively pursuing a negative ideal that requires you to hate yourself and everyone around you. The lesson is, ultimately, like most visual novels, is to love. True love is seeing beyond the ideals and stereotypes you have placed on the people around you. Real, mature love is seeing someone for everything they are, and loving it all.